JJ the CPA here. Let's talk about the EIDL grant, sometimes called the advance, and the PPP and how they interact, how they affect each other. So I want to be sure that when I'm talking about the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Grant, this is the up to $10,000 grant that you got. It's $1,000 per employee up to $10,000. And then the PPP. So what the SBA has made clear is that it doesn't matter when you got the grant, in essence, related to PPP. You got it due to COVID purposes. So you get the grant, and let's say you use it for expenses that do not include any expenses of PPP. Or you got the grant after you used up the PPP. Well, none of that matters. Now, I understand you got the grant. You don't have to pay it back. It's not even forgivable. You just don't have to pay it back, period. What you use the grant for is for your operating expenses. I would call it ongoing expenses, meaning what are the expenses that are ongoing with your business that you would already have been paying, regular expenses. That's what you're using the grant for, which, given that, it's way more potential for what it can be spent on than the narrow scope of what PPP can be spent on. So with both of these things, when you go to file for PPP forgiveness, you will on your application indicate your PPP forgiveness amount, period, with no regard with the EIDL grant other than on your PPP forgiveness application, you will disclose your EIDL. SBA is going to be aware of it, whether you disclose it or not, but nonetheless, you disclose it. When you hand that into the bank, and what the bank hands into the SBA is your forgiveness amount. The SBA has indicated in 3 different spots, they will then, and only them, but they will then reduce down your PPP forgiveness by the amount of your EIDL grant. In essence, the government, the SBA, has indicated that really it's a double dip. The EIDL grant that you got, even though you don't have to pay it back, will reduce down your PPP forgiveness. Do not reduce down your application for the grant. Do not let the bank reduce down your application, your forgiveness amount for the grant. If you got 100,000 PPP and a 10,000 EIDL, and ultimately, yes, 90,000 of this, and hang on, because I'm going to go through the tax adjustment as we know it here on December 18th with this mix of PPP and EIDL. But hear me out. Your application is going to say there's 100,000 forgiven, assuming you have at least 100,000 in covered expenses, met the qualifications, etc. The bank's going to look at it and go, yeah, okay, you've done it. The bank's going to hand in that PPP forgiveness application at 100. The SBA will reduce it by 10,000, and you'll ultimately have 90,000 forgiven. You will then have to pay 10,000 back to the bank. You can't pay back the SBA for the EIDL grant. You only will pay the bank. It will have interest that accrues back to the date of disbursement on the amount that's unforgiven, including then the amount that gets reduced on your PPP forgiveness. Now, when you're going to do your tax adjustment, now it's December 18th. So if you're watching this well beyond December 18th and you want to double check my other videos, I've got a playlist. It's called PPP Taxable. But as it stands right now, unless Congress overrides it very specifically, whatever the forgiveness amount is of your PPP, that is a reduction of your deductions. So whatever the forgiveness amount is. So what you don't want to have happen is that you have an application that you've completed and the bank has approved and sent to the bank, and you go, okay, well, it's 100,000 of PPP forgiveness, and you reduce down your expenses by $100,000. What you would want to do is, and you can intuitively know this because you're going to know you got the grant, but your PPP tax adjustment will be 90,000 in this example because only 90,000 is going to be forgiven. So you'll have a PPP tax adjustment of 90,000, and then you'll also have a $10,000 tax adjustment for the EIDL grant, which means that you're going to reduce down your deductions for the amount of your EIDL grant. So you'll still have a total reduction in this example of $100,000. Just make sure that it's not $110,000 with what you came up with. Don't show that your PPP forgiveness application of the forgiveness amount that you listed, don't show $100,000 of a reduction of your deductions, and then also show a $10,000 reduction of your deductions with the EIDL grant, and thus reducing down your expenses $110,000. You don't want that to happen. You also don't want to put in a PPP forgiveness application and show $90,000, right? It's not up to you. You got to follow the directions. You don't get to say, well, if it's 90, I want to see 90 and I want it to show 90 and it's going to be 90 because the SBA is going to reduce it. Well, I'm just going to do it. Well, the problem is that you hand that into your bank, and even if your bank's like, yep, it's ultimately going to be 90, my concern, and most likely the SBA and the bank would be able to work it out, but why get into the hassle and the question and the confusion and the stress of it? But if the bank is handing in an application saying, well, $90,000 is going to be forgiven, well, the SBA is starting with the $90,000 figure, which means, well, do they start with the $90,000 and then reduce it down by $10,000 for your EIDL grant because no one followed the directions? So in 3 separate places, the SBA couldn't have made it more clear that you as the borrower and the bank does not reduce down the PPP forgiveness amount. Only the SBA does. And again, the reason I'm reiterating that and then giving you this example is you want to make sure that you get your PPP tax adjustment done correctly on your tax return, and also your EIDL grant, in essence, reduction of your deductions. So the way that I'll be reflecting these with my clients, both these adjustments, if you will, is in the other deductions. There will be a line item in the other deductions. There'll be a line item that says PPP tax adjustment, and in that example, it will be minus $90,000, which is a reduction of the other deductions. And then there'll be a separate line item that says EIDL grant tax adjustment, and it'll be $10,000. What I'd like to say in closing is that there's no way that the EIDL grant will change in the fact that it will require a tax adjustment. It will be in 2020, and the self-employed, as well as the C Corp, the S Corp, the partnerships, throw farmers in there too, everyone will be making an adjustment for the EIDL grant. Why? Different from the PPP, it arrived tax-free. It arrived unforgivable. It arrived as, here you go. Here's tax-free money. Use it for these purposes. You're good to go. So with that is classic, okay? EIDL grant, EIDL advance. That is classic, no way around it. A reduction of your deductions, $1,000 per employee up to the $10,000. That's the amount. To be clear, not the EIDL, not the loan. The difference with the PPP and why Congress may override that one is that it was a loan that was provided. EIDL grant was not a loan. It was, here's some money. It's tax-free. It's not income. The expenses that you use it for are not deductible. That's why you're making a negative adjustment on your deductions on your tax return. With PPP, the argument is, including mine, even though I'm going to follow what the IRS says as it's known today, December 18th, the difference with PPP, though, is that it was provided as a loan. And then if you follow the rules and then it gets forgiven, then it becomes exempt from gross income. And it does seem in Congress's intent was that it would have no tax effect. So nonetheless, we're paying attention to, well, is there going to be ultimately a tax adjustment for PPP? Well, I'm just telling you on the EIDL grant, that's not going to change. There's going to be that adjustment. So make sure you get it right, not only on the application to ensure that you get the proper amount forgiven, but then make sure you're making the right adjustments on your tax return, because you definitely don't want to reduce down your expenses more than you have to. All right, hey, listen, I've got 2 seminars coming up at the beginning of January. One's for the self-employed, one's for employers. I got 1 day that I'm doing each, and I've got limited spots. The purpose of those Zooms is that you will bring the documents, the list of documents that I tell you to bring. You bring them to the Zoom, and we will prepare that PPP forgiveness application. It'll be in a group Zoom. But the purpose of it is that we're going to come together and you're going to go step by step. And the goal is that at the end of the Zoom, you're done, you got your documents gathered, and then you're going to go hand it in for hopefully full PPP forgiveness or to the maximum amount that you can. So that's the difference between the Zoom and my videos. I'm still giving out all of the information in my videos, in essence, for free. But the Zoom is, let's get together. Here's your deadline. We'll do it. I'll hold your hand, if you will. There's a group of us. I'll do Q&A. My goal is hopefully everybody gets their questions answered so that, again, at the end of the Zoom, you're done. All right. Hey, thanks for tuning in. I'd love it if you'd subscribe. And then don't you ever forget, you've never met a CPA quite like me.